Few figures in British history evoke such passionate debate as Oliver Cromwell. To some, he is the champion of liberty who shattered the shackles of monarchy and stood for the rights of Parliament. To others, he is the ruthless dictator whose iron-fisted rule was drenched in religious fanaticism and military oppression. A complex man driven by unyielding religious conviction, Cromwell rose from relative obscurity to become Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, a position akin to a monarch in all but name. This essay will journey through the tumultuous life of Oliver Cromwell, exploring his humble beginnings, meteoric rise to power during the English Civil Wars, his controversial leadership of the Commonwealth, and his lasting impact on British political and religious life. Through it, we will grapple with the paradoxes of a man who sought to dismantle tyranny, only to create a new form of it under the banner of divine providence. Oliver Cromwell was born on April 25, 1599, in Huntingdon, a market town in the county of Cambridgeshire, England. His family was of modest gentry status, neither among the grand aristocracy nor the destitute common folk. The Cromwell name bore echoes of prominence, with distant relations to Thomas Cromwell, King Henry VIII's chief minister, though the family's fortune had dwindled by Oliver's time. Educated at Huntingdon Grammar School and later at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, Cromwell's early life was shaped by the strictures of Puritanism. His father, Robert Cromwell, instilled in him a deep sense of religious duty, which would later manifest in his zealous interpretation of God's will for England. Following his father's death in 1617, Oliver returned home to manage the family's limited estates, a task that acquainted him with the grievances of rural landowners and yeoman farmers alike. In 1620, he married Elizabeth Borgia, the daughter of a wealthy London merchant, whose dowry provided a much-needed financial buffer. The marriage was a source of emotional stability for Cromwell throughout his life, and their union produced 9 children. Cromwell's early adulthood was unremarkable in terms of political activity. He served as the Member of Parliament, MP, for Huntingdon in the 1628 Parliament, where he made little impression beyond his advocacy for local issues. However, the seeds of his future political convictions, parliamentary sovereignty, religious reform, and social justice, were already being sown. The years following his brief parliamentary tenure were marked by personal hardship. Cromwell experienced a profound spiritual crisis, grappling with a sense of unworthiness and divine judgment. His correspondence during this period reveals a man beset by melancholia, prone to introspection, and wrestling with his place in God's providence. It was during this spiritual crucible that Cromwell underwent what he later described as a conversion experience, a moment of intense religious awakening that convinced him of his personal election by God. This transformative event cemented his belief in the doctrine of predestination and imbued him with a sense of divine mission. His faith became deeply intertwined with his political ideology. Cromwell came to see the existing religious hierarchy, particularly the Anglican Church and its episcopal structure, as a corrupt edifice needing purification. He aligned himself with the independent Puritans, who rejected centralized church governance in favor of congregational autonomy. This belief in religious liberty, though limited to Puritan sects, would become a cornerstone of his later governance. Meanwhile, King Charles's reign increasingly alienated both Parliament and the populace. His imposition of taxes without parliamentary consent, his marriage to a Catholic queen, and his enforcement of high Anglican liturgical practices ignited widespread resentment. When Charles dissolved Parliament in 1629, embarking on what became known as the personal rule, tensions simmered, and the seeds of civil strife were planted. By 1640, England was teetering on the brink of revolution. Financially crippled by military conflicts in Scotland and Ireland, Charles I was forced to recall Parliament, inadvertently reigniting opposition forces. Cromwell returned to Westminster as MP for Cambridge, now a hardened Puritan warrior with a growing reputation for his fiery speeches and unrelenting calls for reform. As parliamentary grievances escalated into open rebellion, Cromwell's transformation from political agitator to military leader began. Though lacking formal military training, his organizational acumen and unshakable belief in the righteousness of his cause made him a natural commander. The First English Civil War officially erupted in 1642. Cromwell raised a cavalry troop known as the Ironsides, whose strict discipline and Puritan fervor became the backbone of Parliament's military strength. His leadership at the Battle of Marston Moor, 1644, was instrumental in securing a decisive victory for the Parliamentarians, significantly weakening Royalist forces in the north. Cromwell's military genius lay not in classical strategy but in his ability to inspire and maintain the morale of his troops. He selected officers based on merit rather than social rank, a revolutionary approach that both alienated the traditional aristocracy and solidified his popularity among common soldiers. In 1645, Parliament authorized the formation of the new model army, a centralized and professional fighting force designed to deliver a decisive blow against Royalist opposition. Cromwell, appointed as Lieutenant General of Cavalry, played a critical role in shaping the army's ethos, discipline, religious devotion, and meritocratic advancement. The pivotal Battle of Naseby, June 14, 1645, showcased the effectiveness of the new model army. Cromwell's cavalry charges decimated Royalist lines, leading to a comprehensive victory that marked the beginning of the end for Charles I's forces. With successive defeats, the king's position became untenable, and he was eventually captured and imprisoned. However, the war had awakened ideological rifts within the parliamentarian coalition. While moderates sought a negotiated settlement with the king, radicals, including Cromwell and the Levellers, demanded more profound constitutional and religious reforms. These divisions culminated in Pride's Purge, 1648, where the new model army forcibly removed MPs sympathetic to the king, paving the way for Charles I's trial. Cromwell's involvement in the trial and subsequent execution of Charles I on January 30, 1649, was both reluctant and resolute. He did not relish regicide, yet he believed it was a necessary act to break the cycle of monarchical tyranny and to uphold God's will. His famous remark, "We will cut off the head of the king with the crown upon it," encapsulates this grim pragmatism. The execution of a reigning monarch was unprecedented in English history and sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Cromwell and his allies justified it as an act of collective national redemption, a purging of corruption that would pave the way for a godly Commonwealth. With the monarchy abolished and the House of Lords dissolved, England was declared a Commonwealth, a republic governed nominally by Parliament but, in practice, dominated by the military and its commanders. Cromwell emerged as the most influential figure in this new order, though he consistently denied personal ambition, insisting he was merely a servant of God's providence. His immediate task was to secure the fragile republic from internal and external threats. Royalist uprisings flared across England, while Ireland and Scotland remained hotbeds of resistance. Cromwell's subsequent campaigns in Ireland, 1649 to 1650, were marked by brutal sieges, most infamously at Drogheda and Wexford, where his forces slaughtered thousands. These actions have cast a long shadow over his legacy, with many viewing them as acts of ethnic and religious genocide, though Cromwell himself defended them as militarily necessary and divinely sanctioned. In Scotland, Cromwell's campaign culminated in victory at the Battle of Dunbar, 1650, and the decisive rout of Charles II's forces at Worcester, 1651. These victories solidified his reputation as an indomitable military leader and quelled immediate threats to the Commonwealth. Yet political governance proved far more fractious than battlefield command. Parliament was mired in factionalism, unable to implement the sweeping reforms Cromwell envisioned. His frustration with Parliament's inertia led to the dramatic dissolution of the Rump Parliament in 1653, where he famously declared, "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. In the name of God, go." In the aftermath, Cromwell was offered the title of Lord Protector, a role he initially resisted but ultimately accepted, convinced it was his divine duty to guide England through its turbulent reformation. The collapse of the Rump Parliament left a constitutional vacuum that demanded urgent attention. England needed a stable government, yet the idea of restoring the monarchy was anathema to Cromwell and his allies. Thus emerged the Instrument of Government, 1653, England's first written constitution, which established the Protectorate with Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Though the title eschewed monarchical language, the office endowed Cromwell with powers akin to those of a king. He was granted authority over the military, foreign policy, and a significant share of legislative functions. However, unlike a monarch, Cromwell's role was bound by constitutional frameworks, including provisions for triennial parliaments and religious toleration, within limits. Cromwell's installation as Lord Protector was not a coronation of ambition but a reluctant assumption of duty. He was deeply conscious of the accusations of hypocrisy that might follow. Having fought to depose a king, he now embodied the role himself in all but name. Yet, in his mind, this was the fulfillment of divine providence. He was not a sovereign by blood but a servant called by God to shepherd England into righteousness. The first Protectorate Parliament convened in September 1654. Despite Cromwell's hopes for unity and reform, the assembly quickly descended into ideological squabbles. Republicans, resentful of Cromwell's perceived authoritarianism, sought to curtail the powers of the executive. Meanwhile, Presbyterians and religious conservatives bristled at his advocacy for religious toleration among Puritan sects. Cromwell's vision for a godly nation clashed with Parliament's political reality. He sought to establish a society governed by moral integrity, where men of conscience would guide national affairs. However, Parliament's reluctance to implement his reforms, combined with their persistent questioning of his legitimacy, led Cromwell to dissolve the Assembly after only 5 months. His frustration stemmed not from a thirst for absolute power but from a genuine conviction that Parliament was failing its divine mandate. To Cromwell, governance was not a matter of popular consent alone but of aligning with God's will. When Parliament veered from that path, it was his duty to intervene. Faced with royalist conspiracies and a politically recalcitrant Parliament, Cromwell turned to military governance as a means of maintaining order and implementing moral reform. Thus began the rule of the Major Generals, 1655 to 1657, a period where England was divided into 12 military districts, each overseen by a Major General answerable directly to Cromwell. The Major Generals were tasked with suppressing dissent, enforcing Puritan moral codes, and promoting social discipline. They closed alehouses, cracked down on gambling and prostitution, and mandated Sabbath observance. While the policy reflected Cromwell's sincere desire for a reformed, godly society, it was deeply unpopular among the populace, who viewed the Major Generals as oppressive, joyless enforcers of a Puritan theocracy. Despite public backlash, Cromwell defended the initiative as a necessary step to curb vice and restore national piety. Yet he was not blind to its political limitations. By 1657, the policy was quietly abandoned, giving way to a renewed attempt at constitutional settlement through civilian governance. Recognizing the need for broader political legitimacy, Parliament presented Cromwell with the humble petition and advice in 1657, a revised constitution that offered him the crown. This proposal plunged Cromwell into an intense period of soul-searching. Accepting the crown would consolidate authority and pacify traditionalists who longed for monarchical stability. Yet, it would also betray the republican ideals for which many had fought and died. Cromwell ultimately declined the crown, wary of alienating the army and religious radicals who formed the bedrock of his support. Instead, he accepted the offer to continue as Lord Protector under the revised terms, which included the establishment of a second legislative chamber, akin to the House of Lords, and provisions for a more structured executive. The decision to refuse the crown was not born of political expediency alone, it was a deeply personal and spiritual choice. Cromwell believed monarchy, as practiced by the Stuarts, was inherently corrupt. To don a crown would risk reinstituting the very tyranny he had labored to destroy. One of Cromwell's most enduring legacies is his approach to religious toleration, a stance both radical and contradictory. While fiercely committed to Protestantism, Cromwell espoused a relatively broad definition of who could participate in England's religious life. Under his protectorate, the persecution of Puritan sects such as Independents, Baptists, and Quakers was significantly curtailed. He allowed for a pluralistic religious landscape among Protestants, so long as their beliefs did not threaten social order or openly challenge the state church. This policy was revolutionary in a nation accustomed to religious uniformity enforced by state power. Cromwell's most controversial act of religious inclusion was the readmission of Jews to England in 1656, reversing their expulsion since 1290. Though driven partly by millenarian beliefs, Cromwell saw the return of Jews as a precursor to Christ's second coming. It was also a pragmatic decision grounded in economic and social considerations. However, Cromwell's toleration had clear limits. Catholics remained marginalized and persecuted, particularly in Ireland, where Cromwell's military campaigns had left deep scars. For Cromwell, Catholicism represented not just a theological error but a political threat tied to foreign influence and sedition. Cromwell's foreign policy was an extension of his religious vision. He sought to position England as a Protestant bulwark against Catholic powers in Europe, while also expanding its commercial and maritime influence. In alliance with France, Cromwell's forces captured the strategic port of Dunkirk from Spain in 1658, a significant military victory that bolstered England's standing on the continent. His navy, revitalized under Admiral Robert Blake, asserted dominance over the Mediterranean, challenging the corsairs of North Africa and enhancing England's maritime prestige. Cromwell also launched the ill-fated Western Design, an ambitious but poorly executed campaign aimed at seizing Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. The expedition, particularly the disastrous assault on Hispaniola, was a humiliating failure. However, the capture of Jamaica in 1655 offered a consolation prize, laying the foundation for England's future colonial expansion in the region. Cromwell's foreign policy combined messianic zeal with pragmatic statecraft. He envisioned England as a chosen nation, an exemplar of godly governance tasked with defending Protestantism globally. Yet, he also understood the necessity of alliances and economic interests, balancing ideology with geopolitical realities. The final years of Cromwell's life were marked by personal grief, political exhaustion, and a sense of unfinished mission. The death of his beloved daughter, Elizabeth Claypole, in 1658 devastated him emotionally. Her passing, seen by many as a divine rebuke, plunged Cromwell into a period of deep mourning. Politically, the Protectorate remained precarious. Though Cromwell had established relative stability, the Republic lacked a clear mechanism for succession. The factionalism within Parliament and the army persisted, and royalist sentiments simmered beneath the surface. On September 3, 1658, Oliver Cromwell succumbed to a fever, likely complicated by kidney disease or malaria. His death left a vacuum in the Protectorate's leadership. Though he had named his son, Richard Cromwell, as his successor, Richard lacked his father's charisma, military prowess, and political acumen. The Protectorate, so closely tied to Oliver Cromwell's personal authority, unraveled rapidly. Cromwell's death set in motion a swift unraveling of the Commonwealth. Richard Cromwell's brief tenure as Lord Protector ended in political collapse, and by 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II. The restoration marked a decisive repudiation of Cromwellian republicanism. In a symbolic act of posthumous retribution, Cromwell's body was exhumed from Westminster Abbey in 1661 and subjected to a macabre ritual of posthumous execution. His corpse was hanged, beheaded, and the head displayed on a pike outside Westminster Hall, a grim testament to the enduring animosity he had inspired. Yet, despite the Restoration's immediate rejection of Cromwell's political project, his legacy proved resilient. His insistence on parliamentary sovereignty, religious toleration, within Protestantism, and meritocratic governance left an indelible imprint on British political culture. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the subsequent constitutional monarchy would enshrine many principles Cromwell had championed, albeit within a different framework. Oliver Cromwell's legacy is as complex as the man himself. To some, he is a heroic liberator who stood against tyranny and laid the groundwork for constitutional governance. To others, he is a military despot and religious zealot whose rule brought censorship, repression, and bloodshed. This paradox, of a man who championed liberty yet wielded authoritarian power, makes Cromwell one of history's most enigmatic figures. His experiment with republicanism, though ultimately short-lived, marked a seismic shift in English political consciousness. Never before had a reigning monarch been publicly tried and executed by his own subjects, nor had England been governed by a written constitution. Cromwell's Commonwealth and Protectorate were radical departures from the traditional hereditary monarchy, demonstrating that alternative forms of governance were possible, even if fleeting. However, Cromwell's failure to institutionalize a stable republican framework reveals the limitations of his vision. The Protectorate lacked a durable constitutional settlement, and Cromwell's reliance on military force alienated many who had initially supported him. His ideal of a godly nation was never fully realized, stymied by the practicalities of governing a diverse and politically fractured society. One of Cromwell's most hotly debated legacies concerns his stance on religious freedom. On one hand, his policies marked a significant departure from the rigid uniformity enforced by previous monarchs. He permitted a wide array of Protestant sects to worship freely, protected Quakers from persecution, and even allowed the return of Jews to England after a 350-year ban. Yet Cromwell's toleration was selective. His refusal to extend religious freedom to Catholics, particularly in Ireland, underscores the sectarian limitations of his vision. The brutal campaigns in Ireland, marked by massacres at Drogheda and Wexford, have been condemned as acts of religious and ethnic genocide. Cromwell defended these actions as necessary to quell rebellion and secure Protestantism, but their legacy has left deep scars, especially in Irish historical memory. Thus, Cromwell's legacy as a proponent of religious freedom is complicated. He advanced the principle of religious plurality within Protestantism but remained intolerant of faiths he viewed as politically subversive or heretical. His vision of liberty was inseparable from his theological convictions, a liberty for the godly rather than a universal right. Cromwell's place in historical writing has oscillated wildly over the centuries, reflecting the shifting tides of political and cultural sentiment. Royalist historiography. In the immediate aftermath of the Restoration, Cromwell was vilified as a usurper and regicide. Royalist narratives painted him as a hypocritical tyrant who cloaked his lust for power in religious rhetoric. His posthumous execution and the public desecration of his remains were intended to expunge his memory as a traitor to the crown. Whig historiography. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Whig historians re-evaluated Cromwell as a proto-liberal who advanced parliamentary sovereignty and individual liberties. Figures like Thomas Carlyle championed Cromwell as a heroic leader, a man of action who reshaped England through sheer force of character and conviction. Carlyle's Oliver Cromwell's Letters and Speeches, 1845, sought to humanize Cromwell, portraying him as a reluctant revolutionary driven by duty rather than ambition. Marxist historiography. Marxist scholars interpreted Cromwell through the lens of class struggle, viewing the English Civil War as a bourgeois revolution that displaced feudal aristocracy. For Marxist historians like Christopher Hill, Cromwell was a revolutionary who facilitated the rise of a capitalist order. Though his alliance with the gentry and his suppression of radical leveler movements revealed his limitations as a true revolutionary. Revisionist historiography. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, historians adopted a more nuanced and critical view. Revisionists emphasized Cromwell's contradictions, his genuine religious idealism coexisting with political pragmatism, his advocacy for liberty constrained by authoritarian practices. Scholars like John Morrill and Antonia Fraser have painted a more complex portrait, resisting simplistic labels of hero or villain. While the Protectorate ultimately collapsed, Cromwell's challenge to monarchical absolutism had lasting consequences. The very act of putting a king on trial signified a profound assertion of popular sovereignty, the idea that rulers are accountable to the governed. Cromwell's governance, albeit flawed, introduced foundational concepts that would later underpin constitutional democracy. Parliamentary sovereignty. Though Cromwell often clashed with Parliament, his career affirmed the principle that legislative authority should not be subservient to the whims of a monarch. Religious toleration. Within bounds, his partial embrace of religious pluralism foreshadowed later developments in civil liberties, even if his policies were inconsistent and exclusionary. Meritocracy in governance. Cromwell's emphasis on selecting officials based on ability rather than birthright challenged entrenched aristocratic privilege and hinted at a more egalitarian model of governance. Written constitutionalism. The instrument of government and humble petition and advice were pioneering attempts to codify governance structures through written constitutional documents, a concept that would later flourish in democratic systems worldwide. However, it is crucial to recognize Cromwell's limitations. His vision of governance was deeply theocratic, and his tolerance extended only to those who conformed to his Puritan worldview. His suppression of radical movements like the Levelers, who advocated for universal suffrage and equality before the law, underscores his reluctance to embrace full democratic ideals. Cromwell's legacy remains contested in Britain and Ireland, reflecting the enduring wounds of his military campaigns and the divisive nature of his rule. In England, Cromwell is remembered with a mix of admiration and ambivalence. Statues of him stand outside Parliament, symbolizing his role in the evolution of parliamentary democracy. Yet, his authoritarian tendencies and puritanical social policies temper any celebration of him as a purely democratic figure. In Ireland, Cromwell's name evokes bitter memories of conquest, massacre, and religious persecution. His campaigns in Ireland are remembered as acts of ethnic and religious violence, fostering a legacy of hostility that persists in Irish collective memory. In Scotland, Cromwell is seen as a conqueror who subdued the nation militarily but also introduced certain reforms. His pragmatic dealings with Scottish Presbyterianism contrast with his brutal military campaigns. Modern political discourse often invokes Cromwell as a cautionary figure, a symbol of the perils of mixing religious absolutism with political power, yet also a reminder of the transformative potential of determined leadership. Cromwell's impact extended beyond British shores. Though his own republic was short-lived, his defiance of monarchy inspired republican thinkers across Europe and the Atlantic world. The idea that sovereignty resides not in kings but in the people resonated with later revolutionary movements, including the American Revolution. The Founding Fathers were well versed in the history of the English Civil War. Cromwell's challenge to absolute monarchy, his emphasis on constitutional governance, and his experiment with written constitutions informed debates in revolutionary America. The French Revolution. While the French Revolution's leaders were more radical and secular than Cromwell, his model of overturning hereditary monarchy in favor of representative institutions served as a historical precedent. Global republicanism. Cromwell's protectorate, despite its shortcomings, proved that non-monarchical governance was not only possible but capable of exerting military and diplomatic influence on the European stage. Oliver Cromwell's life is a study in contradictions. A man of deep personal piety who presided over acts of ruthless military suppression. A champion of liberty who dissolved elected assemblies when they opposed him. A revolutionary who rejected a king's crown, yet ruled with quasi-monarchical authority. Cromwell's legacy defies simplistic categorization. He was neither the democratic hero lauded by Whig historians nor the villainous tyrant vilified by royalist apologists. Instead, he was a complex product of his time, a deeply religious man navigating the treacherous currents of political revolution, civil war, and constitutional experimentation. The tensions within Cromwell's career, between liberty and order, between religious freedom and sectarianism, between visionary idealism and pragmatic authoritarianism, mirror the perennial dilemmas faced by societies undergoing radical transformation. His failure to establish a lasting republic does not diminish his historical significance. Cromwell shattered the illusion of divine right monarchy and compelled a nation to confront fundamental questions about authority, governance, and the rights of conscience. The constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy that eventually emerged in Britain owed much to the precedents, both cautionary and inspirational, set during Cromwell's tumultuous rule. In the final analysis, Oliver Cromwell was not the architect of modern democracy. But he was one of its earliest and most influential agitators, a man whose imperfect experiment with republicanism reverberated far beyond the short-lived Commonwealth he once led.